Hello everyone and welcome to the Landor Links Gender on the Agenda webinar, and today we're talking about addressing gender-specific transport needs, actionable insights. This series of Gender on the Agenda events is brought to you very kindly, sponsored by Mott, MacDonald and the Urban Transport Group, and we are incredibly indebted to them for enabling us to have these discussions. I would like to say in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to worry about gender issues in transport, but that's probably not quite true. Gender needs tend to be sort of threefold. Some of them are practical. I'm 5'2", and a lot of women tend to be a little bit shorter than the gentlemen. So reaching the handrails on public transport can be quite difficult. So some of those factors do need to be taken account of. Women also have frequently different needs from their journeys, often chaining their journeys or having caring needs. So again, these are practicalities that any transport system needs to take account of, regardless of it's gentlemen, women or non-binary people with caring roles. But the area that gets a lot of attention, and the area where ideally we wouldn't have to think about this, but we do, is sadly around safety and making women and girls and younger ladies feel safe in public transport. So what we'd like to look at in the next hour and a quarter or so is really practical ways we can approach these matters. A lot of local authorities and public transport people don't want to be unfair in their transport systems. They'd like to make things better, but sometimes they just don't know how to do it. And today on the panel, I've got three very amazing experts who are going to help talk this through with me. We've got Karla Jakeman, who's the Connected Transport Innovation Lead from Innovate UK. Scott Cain, who's the founder and CEO of Active Things and an associate at the Connected Places Catapult. And Andrea Gorini, who's head of research at Transform Transport. And I'd like to start by inviting Karla and Scott to talk about a survey that's been carried about on lived experiences of women and girls in relation to everyday journeys. Scott and Karla, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Sharon. So, hello everybody. A great opportunity to talk to you about what has been a fascinating project for myself and for Karla, who you will see very shortly and hear from very shortly. Possibly for myself as a man that's seeking to understand and better understand some of the real lived experiences. So not somebody else's interpretation of how women experience transport and different types of everyday journeys, but actually just really trying to dig into the lived experiences and the real language about how women have described the different barriers that they face as they make their everyday journeys. This builds upon a project that Karla and I did with the amazing Glenn Lyons around the topic of combo travel, which is perhaps we'll define it more fully, but essentially think about active travel in combination with a mechanized form of transport. And so when we started probing that a bit more and trying to understand the barriers to combo travel, it almost inevitably led us to try and understand actually what are some of the barriers that and some of the lived experiences that women have in all the different forms of transport. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. I should say that Karla and I work very closely, and indeed the research was led by two amazing design researchers, so Lucy and Ness, who are not with us today, but who brought their particular areas of expertise to help us really understand the research question and the survey and the defining of the topic using their kind of professional experience. We also, I think, benefited enormously from, we stood on the shoulders of giants, really. So not least, we relied heavily on a brilliant book. If anybody's about to embark on a research project, I would say dig out Caroline Jarrett's Surveys That Work. It was an enormously helpful thing for us to dig into. We also built upon and really benefited from in the mini literature review that we did. There's amazing work that's been done in the academic community and the research. There was also work that's a slightly more applied stage. So people like Arup's work on designing cities with and for women was a fantastic set of insights. we then use that to then inform the nature of the questions that we really try to understand. And I suppose we try to learn from what were some of the things that could help us get the right kind of answers from the right people, that could help inform action, which is essentially why Karla has commissioned this work in the first instance, to help innovators think about real lived experiences and how products and services and policies can be designed differently. It's really important that we're sensitive to different gendered ways of understanding the whole world around us. But in particular, if we're trying to encourage more people to make more journeys on foot, by bike, and in combination with bus, train, etc., we really sought to understand kind of different gendered identities, intersectionality, all of these kind of really important topics. We then tried to then frame questions in a way that would be as accessible and relatable as possible. We also benefited from working with people like Sophie Randall, a colleague of Karla's at Innovate UK, who latterly was at Transport for West Midlands, where she led or was actively involved in some of the work around violence against women and girls. So we've worked very closely with a number of people who are kind of steeped in this kind of stuff as well. So as we'll see on the next slide, Karla, if you could take us to the top of the mountain and explain what we mean by some of the terms that's in this.
Okay, Scott, thank you. And I think Scott's played his part down quite a lot there. Scott's been instrumental with Lucy and Ness and the team working on this. So thank you, Scott. So as mentioned, what do we mean by this? So active travel, we know, is cycling and walking. And as Scott mentioned, combo travel is very much this combination of bringing together an active form of transport with a bus or a car or a taxi or an e-scooter, for example. How can we enable people to travel part of the way as usual, but then also actively travel part of the way if they are unable to actively travel all of the way for a variety of different reasons? And that's a whole different webinar, which some of you may have already seen. But this lived experience, we really needed to understand firsthand, what are the barriers, what are the problems, what are people experiencing? And I make no apologies that this report will make some very difficult reading. It's quite anger inducing, unfortunately, but it is what it is, and that's important, that it's realistic. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see what we set out to do, which was very much about understanding what was inconvenient, what happened when things were inconvenient, how did people change their travel, the patterns of harassment, and unpacking all of that. Again, how will people travel differently? Will they get a 10-minute taxi ride, or sorry, a 2-minute taxi ride instead of walking 10 minutes because they're afraid of that particular harassment? So what causes anxiety? Scott will unpack some of these in a moment, but what are the kind of things that caused women and girls stress? And some of these were quite surprising, actually. Some we expected and some were quite surprising. How do people react when they feel unsafe? What changes do they make? Are they deliberate or are they very much planned? So some of those came into it, the cultural aspects, as you would expect, and how they will, how those changes manifested in people's decisions on how and when they travelled. And then what kind of safety measures people were taking to feel less vulnerable when they're travelling. So what were they doing? And again, that was quite eye-opening as to what extent people will go to, women will go to feel safer. If we go on to the next slide, please, Brad. You will see when this report comes out, you will see it's fairly colloquial, actually, and that is on purpose, because we didn't want to dilute the voices. We wanted real people with real voices, quite rightly, because these are genuine people who have genuine concerns when they travel, and we wanted to reflect that. And as we were going through it, automatically, I guess quite a few of us were in the world of innovation anyway. Quite a few of us were already starting to think, okay, what might we be able to do to alleviate some of those concerns? How can we use innovation to solve some of those concerns? And also we had a number of the survey respondents were interviewed in a bit more depth, just to get a bit more information. But if we go on to the next slide, you will see that there are some limitations which we wanted to just flag. So those of us who were sending out the survey through Twitter and LinkedIn and all of those good things, our communities do tend to be transport based, rightly or wrongly. So you know, we are transport professionals, so it was we did expect that. However, we did try to break out of those areas and go wider afield into different groups, but we are aware that there is a little bit of a transport bias. But at the end of the day, we are all people who travel. We are all mums who travel, or female professionals, or girls that travel, or whatever. So, you know, we've got that personal experience as well as from the professional side. Just to flag as well that the literature review, it was a mini one. It was very quick. It's not exhaustive. And again, that just demonstrates that there's a lot more that we can do. And I think that the final thing on this slide really is just to say, we didn't, we felt that if you group too much into themes, you can lose the nuance, you can lose that richness, because it's so vast and it's so complex that if you just compartmentalize, you do lose things, and we don't want to do that. So again, there's some of the limitations. And just briefly on the next slide, the overview of what we did. I don't think that there'll be any surprises that safety is a huge aspect. Journey time and convenience, huge aspect. But when you see the report, you will also see that the reasons for some of those convenience factors are a bit more surprising than I think some of us felt. So I'm not going to go into any more detail because Scott's going to unpack some of it. But if we just go on to the next slide, how did this make us feel? A lot of this we expected. You know, we expected to see that women don't like walking alone down a street in the dark. That wasn't surprising, but there was an awful lot of it that made us really angry. I will admit to you that when I first saw the draft, I had to walk away and calm down and then come back and read it again. I was like, this is 2022. Why are we still having this issue? And I got really quite angry and upset by it. And that's good. I think everyone who reads this gets angry and upset, because then we're more likely to do something about it. We're more likely to trigger solutions and find solutions to try and make that change. So we hope that that kind of anger will lead to some great solutions to some of these issues. But that was my experience as a female reading this, a female in the transport sector. But Scott, over to you. I mean, how did it make you feel reading this as a male?
I was probably a little bit more shocked, if anything, by some of the things that came through consistently. But it then helps you see the world in a different way, and therefore helps you begin to think about how you can play your own part in trying to affect change. And you know, clearly we want every woman and girl to feel, and indeed to have the right to experience transport, experience cities and experience places on their own terms, and you know, to avoid some of the consistent themes that came through is really it's incumbent upon society, it's incumbent upon transport operators, it's incumbent upon policymakers, it's incumbent upon innovators to really think deeply about some of these real human needs that come through and how things can be done differently. Because quite clearly, the way things are right now, the world is largely designed by men, managed by men in terms of transport services. And many of these kind of very specific points of lived experience that need to be considered differently, we need to do something about it. This can't, as you say, it's 2022 now, we can't be doing this again in 2030 and seeing the same things. So I think that's why it needs to be used as fuel for innovators to do things differently. So if we could just move on to skip on to the next couple of slides. So whilst Karla said that we have done our very best to try and faithfully report, in the words of the study participants. We have grouped things into 13 different barriers that came out of the way that it was that sort of organically appeared, and these are barriers in particular to combo travel, but also to which obviously takes in all forms of bus, train, car journeys, as well as cycling, walking, and other forms of active travel like wheeling. These were things like traveling in the dark, parking and storage came out, connections, pricing, cost and affordability of certain, well, particularly combination services or multimodal services, and information provision. We're just going to dive into a couple of these. So let's take risk of sexual harassment, for example. So what came very clearly is that women use alternative routes and methods to avoid certain areas that they might perceive, or indeed have themselves experienced something negative. And then when feeling unsafe, women alter their routes depending on time of day, time of year, and so forth, in order to take what they feel is the safest transport option. And then to avoid the risk of sexual harassment, women focus on using not always the quickest route, but they really, what comes through very consistently is that sometimes people will take a much longer route, but it might be well lit, or it might be busier. It might involve, changing for that final leg of the journey, things that they would do. They're behaving very differently as a result of, wanting to minimize risk of sexual harassment. So just moving on. So I won't read these out, but necessarily all of them. But what comes through, as Karla says, is you read them, and the consistency of these from nearly 400 respondents, they're a really depressing set of patterns to do with being followed, drunken behaviour towards women, and then the action that woman or girl has then adopted in order to avoid that repeat time and time again. If we move on to the next slide, please. So what these naturally do is then prompt, I guess, kind of innovation statements, like how might we enable women to plan and alter journeys using a combination of travel options so that they can avoid these kind of situations of sexual harassment. How might we provide immediate support to women who feel at risk or harassed during the journey, so they can get the help that they need? How might we design combo travel options for women and girls so that they can complete the final mile of their journey safely and without fear of harassment? So just three of the kind of how might we statements that came through. There was teasing out this kind of three particular areas around everyday travel infrastructure. So one of those was around traveling with children and things. Slightly clumsy way of putting it, but that's how we ended up grouping it. But there are very specific needs for women when traveling with children, and then distinctly when traveling with things, and then in traveling with those both children and things. So that's everything from laptops for work, might be groceries. I mean, trip training's been mentioned already. It might be stuff for the kids. And then there are particular pinch points or moments in the daily life of many of the women that were surveyed, around things like schools don't, the way that the services and the way that the policies around schools are kind of designed, they don't really help young women and girls use active forms of transport. And that might be that there's no place for their kids to keep their bikes. It might be that scooters aren't allowed at at the school. It might be that the getting onto a bus for the rural part of a journey is not possible because you've got nowhere to put your bike for that part of the journey. So moving on to the next slide, please. Again, so having to get a child to school on a bike is sometimes challenging. It relies on his good road sense and willingness to cycle before 8 a.m. It sometimes feels more convenient just to jump in the car, a car that we're cycling past. Or traveling with grocery shopping, this is a weekly hassle and can be partly mitigated by staying away from busy times, such as the school run. But I'm lucky that many other women do the same and on the buses use, so we can provide considerate behaviour to other passengers. So moving on to the next slide, please. So the kind of how might we statements here is, how might we improve travel infrastructure and services for women so that they can safely and comfortably travel with young children or physical items? How might we evidence the benefits of designing transport systems that enable women to travel safely with their children so that more transport is designed with women and children in mind? again, you'll see when you're seeing the report, you'll see there's a number of these how might we statements. Moving on to the next one, please. So in terms of next steps, the report will be available, we think, during October, and everybody who signed up to the webinar will receive this via our friends at Landor. We're also going to be doing some roundtables and workshops. So I guess that's when we dig into, okay, so what will be different as a result of the, the lived experience insights. Again, we would actively seeking participants for that. So again, if we're able to capture their interest in participating via Landor, that would be fantastic. And then reactions from men and women working in transport, and indeed and then innovators, and indeed just the people who are on the call today. We're actively seeking feedback. What points of parallels, what point of consistencies, anything that kind of jars and doesn't make sense. That's what we really want to hear about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott and Karla. We'll do questions after the second presentation, and I realised that in my enthusiasm to hear what the pair had to say, I forgot to ask you, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can keep track of them. I've seen there's a few comments being put in there already. So I'd now like to move on to our second presentation, which is from Andrea Guarini, who's going to be talking to us about understanding gender-specific transport needs using open data.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you also for inviting me and Transport to join this event. I truly appreciate the presentation by Karla and Scott. And so now I would like to focus more on the use of open data for example, for mapping, and also looking at the needs and expectation of women using open data. And just a very short introduction about Transport, which is a no-profit research foundation, which has been recently launched by Systematica, which is a consultancy based in Milan. And we do focus on sustainable mobility, but also inclusive mobility, using the SDG goal as a reference for all the research projects we conduct. And we do produce also publication, which are open access. And the very last one is focused on the impact of the pandemic, but we are planning to have a dedicated publication for the next year related to gender inclusion in transport system. And brief introduction also about the research approach we use for collecting and analyzing data. And as you can see, our research approach is based on the urban informatics framework, which means we combine different disciplines from the urban planning, traffic engineer, but also ICT technology and social sciences. By the way, I am an environmental psychologist, so trying to merge very different skills and knowledge within the research foundation here. And we study women inclusion, gender inclusion at different scale, from the macro scale, the city level, to the micro scale. So for example, the possibility to design public space, looking at the needs and expectation of women. And we use very different data, from the big one to the small one, very qualitative, but also GIS and space syntax or simulation tools, which are meant to digest all this information to provide practical insights for a better design of our cities. And I want also to slightly extend the definition of gender inclusion. So if we consider gender not as the same as biological sex differences, also we have to consider that gender defines roles in between men and women from our society and cultural background. So from the previous presentation, we see that which are the barriers limiting the use of public transport, for example, for women. But we should also consider that the safety issue and also the needs of comfort in public space is not only related to women, but the concept of gender is a more extended one. And on the left side of the slide, you can see above the SDG goal, which are related to this research topic, also the two largest initiatives from the European Union at the global level. So UN Women from United Nations and Women in Transport from the European Commission. So the first project I want to introduce you is called Diamond, and it was an H2020 project funded by the European Union, started in 2018 and ended this year in January. And it was a very large project participated by Systematic, and it was focused on 4 use cases. So from the needs and expectation of women as users of public transport, considering railway, autonomous vehicle, and public sharing services, but also the needs of women as employees in the transport system. And the project was a very complex one, considering the topic, and it was based on a multidisciplinary methodology for collecting very different data, from GIS data to social media data from Twitter, but also questionnaires and focus groups. And the scope of the project was to conduct research about this topic, but also to provide practical definition for the transport operator. So if you are interested about this topic and the Diamond project, you can find on the website a white paper which summarizes all the results of the project, and also the toolkit called Toolkit for Fairness, which is a very practical tool for self-assessment. So if you are part of a transport operator, for example, you could use this tool, which is open access, to assess the level of fairness of the service, but also the infrastructures. And just to give you an example, the first use case was focused on the railway system. So we collaborate with FGC and ZTM, which are the 2 transport operators in the province of Barcelona and the metropolitan area of Warsaw in Poland. So this tool is meant to look at the features, the characteristics of the infrastructure for a better understanding if the infrastructure itself is inclusive towards the needs and expectation of women. And the second project is related to a smartphone application, which is called Where. Where was recently donated to Walk21, which is a charity based in the UK. And it was a startup funded by 2 in Italy. And it's still available in the Italian market, and is a routing app, very similar to Google Maps, let's say. So it gives you suggestion to go from A to B by walking, is meant to map the level of security perceived by other users of the app for walkability, let's say. So the app at that time, 2 years ago, was meant to be launched in the city of Barcelona, and Transport collaborated with the owner of the app for a GIS mapping activity of the city of Barcelona for a better understanding of where the area, the neighborhood of the city of Barcelona to be prioritized for the launching of the app. And so the GIS map was meant to collect many different open data regarding the city. So at the bottom, you can see from the urban fabric level, so the land use of the city, but also the presence of urban green areas, point of interest from the nightlife to university and college and tourist attractions, but also some demographics regarding the density of female population, but also the availability of transport services. So all these information were combined into the model to understanding where to launch the app first. So the area of the city which should be prioritized for this service, which is meant to enhance the level of safety and security for women while walking. And the third and last project is focused on the city of New York. And so as you probably know, let's say the open data available for the city of New York is pretty large and uncomparable to the open data available in the EU. It's much easier to find detailed data available regarding many different aspects. So the research here was meant to assess the level of walkability for women in the city. And the theoretical framework we use for mapping the level of walkability is divided in 4 main criteria. So usefulness, which is very much related to the concept of the 15-minute city. So the accessibility of proximity services. The second one is the level of comfort. So you can see data were focused on the width of sidewalk, park zones, and open square. And the third one, which was defined by the literature review as the most important one, was safety and security. And the very last parameter we considered was the open data set from the New York City Police Department. So the harassment data, geolocalized harassment data, for example. And the fourth and last one is the level of attractiveness of the city. For example, the presence of restaurant or cafe. And the four different maps related to usefulness, comfort, safety, and attractiveness were then combined to define a unique index defining the level of walkability for women, and which was then compared to the one available, which is called National Walkability Index, which is provided by the Federal Agency for Environmental Protection in the US. And as you can see, the results of, let's say, our index on the right side of the slide is less optimistic, let's say. So this research is meant to, again, to understand which are the areas of the city we should be prioritized for intervention related to service provision, but also design of the urban space. So a few final remarks. So first, there are some, let's say, controversial aspects related to the use of open data, but first also to the definition of women as vulnerable road users, which is still the definition taken from the SDG 11.2, which refer to elderly children, women as vulnerable road users. So I think we should somehow also try to put some effort in the language we use talking about gender inclusion of women. A second controversial aspect I see is that the universal design approach is somehow not taking into account the specific needs of some target user, for example, women. So I do prefer to use a user-centric approach. Then there is the also the possibility that for example, the provision of open data related to crimes, harassment, could turn into a vicious cycle, for example, which lead to no-go area. So for example, also the use of the web app, so a smartphone app, which highlight the most dangerous area of a city for walkability at nighttime, for example, could turn this area to become even less accessible and less inclusive for the needs of women. So there is, I think, all the results presented here should be used for engaging even more the general public and to raise the public awareness about the problem, and also to get the end user very much engaged in the solution. There is also the possibility to overcome the limit in the very general definition of gender, to extend this definition instead of considering a binary definition between male and female. For example, during the Diamond project, we did use an intersectional approach, which was based on considering different demographics aspect of the citizens, and gender is one of them. I also want to highlight the lack of data. So there is a data gap at country and regional level here in Europe. And if you are curious about the Diamond project, I want to also suggest you to have a look at the sister project, which was funded in parallel by the European Union, which is called Tingo. So if Diamond was more related to policy and let's say practical information for a better design of the city and infrastructure, Tingo was more focused on building a data portal. So everything is open access. You can find information very easy on the web. These are some references if you want to know more, and feel free to email me and Transport if you want to know more about this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was really interesting. I've been watching the questions in the chat, and as Karla's just said, there are some quite strong feelings sort of bubbling, or not even bubbling away here, being expressed. And I agree fully. We shouldn't be telling women to change their journeys. We shouldn't be inventing solutions to make women feel safer. I drum it into my 15-year-old that if he sees a lady walking up the street by himself, he should cross over the road. But we've probably got several generations of work to do to tackle this. And I would like to think that this is just a temporary solution and that we're not here again in 10 years' time. So to all those that said we should change the behaviour, not the women's journeys, I fully agree with you. But sadly, in the meantime, we do need to protect and make our transport networks feel safer. And I was reminded there was an organisation in Scotland who still exists called Strut Safer. And they are there simply if a lady or a young lady is feeling unsafe, they will talk to her on the phone all the way home just so she feels she has company. So, you know, it's people helping each other, but I wish we didn't have to do it. To address some of the issues, sorry, I'm getting emotional now. We had some very interesting discussions there. I think I might just go back a little bit. One of the very first questions we had, and this is probably to all three of you, and Scott, you can put your camera on if you'd like. Thank you.
I was awaiting guidance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
As I say, it applies to all of you. It was about how did you make sure the sample was from a variety of communities and groups. I mean, I know, Karla, you mentioned, and I did actually do the survey, that we are a particular industry and we have friends who are in the particular industry. But also, you know, to Andrea, does open data sometimes hide women because they may be the ones that are less likely to have the new tech and the ones less likely to have smart devices and smartphones? Does it overlook younger people who don't have these things? So, you know, to all three of you, do you think you had a representative sample here? And I guess I know the answer, but what might it have shown if the sample wasn't representative and you could have reached more people? Karla, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. And just to reiterate what you said to Ailey and to Jackie, 11 billion% agree we shouldn't be having to do this, but we are. But I think to make sure that we had a large variety of respondents, we did keep checking it and we were analysing it, and we were very conscious of it, especially, for example, we felt that it was a little bit too white orientated to start with. So we were looking for wider groups where we could target the survey to try and get more diverse respondents. And definitely with regards to the question about trans women and non-binary folk, again, definitely covered. My closest friend is a trans female and very much wanted to make sure she could help to get that out to different groups, which she did. So we tried very hard to make sure that we were covering all of the protected characteristics rather than just send it out and see what happens. You know, we were monitoring that when it came back. Scott, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
Only to say that we were very kind of deliberate and intentional to try and, for example, reach out to groups like Black Women Do Run, for example, because we recognize that, and similarly kind of certain cycling organizations, as well as kind of a blend between rural and sort of urban areas. We were looking at, I'm very mindful that we didn't appear to be getting sufficient numbers of women in the over 65 age group. So we then very deliberately sought to then engage via networks and particular places where we might be able to engage more women of that kind of demographic profile. So we were very mindful that we wanted to try and get really good representation from all sections of society. That said, we do recognize that actually achieving that in the methods that we then chose to do, which was principally an online survey as well as some online interviews, there are some limitations there, and that's kind of baked in, and we're aware of that in the methodology. So I think there is certainly opportunity for others to both, in the way that we've sought to add value to what's already in existence. I think there's much more that could still be done on this topic.
Thanks. And Audrey, coming on to you and the open data, do you think it was representative, or do you think there might have been, it might have been missing some aspects?
Yeah, let's say the best example I have in mind is the Diamond project, which was meant also to say somehow to break the wall of the lack of data. So it was on a very extended one, 3 years, 1 year and a half collecting data, but it was not easy at all. And so the sample at the time of the project was kind of representative of the EU region, because the project itself was meant to collect data from at least 10 to 12 countries, looking at gender, but also age, ethnicity, social context, economical context. Intersectional approach was the way also the different demographics were combined. But I think one of the best results of the project was at the time of the evaluation, final one, was to have an open dialogue with Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the EU region. So what we asked to them is to be more available to, have a more flexible data collection during census activity. So in the way for the next census at the EU region level, the data could be more representative of this intersectional approach. But on the other way around, I see some of the open data available. For example, the data set related to security for the city of New York somehow could be, risky to use this open data to make this data available, in the sense that if you do map the level of security, somehow you are going to in a vicious cycle to not really to have a better, more safe city, but to have a neighborhood which is a no-go area. So somehow, it's not easy, in the way to collect, also to disseminate this data.
No, thanks. And I did see there's a question saying, from a research point of view, what additional data would you like to have available? And it made me think a little bit of those smiley faces you get at airports. Perhaps we should have them on buses and trains. Did you feel safe on your journey today? But more tangibly, what other data do you think might be useful? Do we want to be trying to sentiment map these things that might fit into something a bit like the walking maps, or what other data do you think might be useful? Anybody that wants to?
I guess that I think that if local authorities, for example, and car park providers could be more active in providing data. For example, a lot of the comments were around where the docking stations are for bikes. So they're often in a dark corner of a car park, which, and I do want to also say this, it's not just females who feel vulnerable in those situations, it's men as well, and boys, not just females and girls, or any other protected characteristic. So, this is a genuine human thing that we don't like going into those dark corners. So when it comes to planning, can car park providers or can local authorities consider that, and then use that data to say, we have reduced our number of dark corner situations, whatever you'd call it, by X amount, and just demonstrating that it is being thought about when it comes to the planning stage. And I think that would be particularly useful.
If I could build on that, I think better and a deeper understanding of the nature of trips that are taking place and the extent to which I guess the end-to-end journey is better understood in things like the NTS and so forth. I think there's opportunity to understand that there are particular points consistent points within those kind of journeys that really warrant greater attention. And so, for example, if we just stick with the sort of traveling with children, one of the suggestions for one of the study participants was actually it's not easy to use, say, city bikes if you are traveling with children in their teens, and actually because of policy and so forth, but actually if you're a responsible parent, should you be able to be given access to be able to essentially have a ticket that allows you to take one or two of your dependence, and then also to be able to use shared transport, or access to shared cargo bikes and that being much more prevalent, if you've got, for example, younger children and so forth. So it's thinking through what are the kind of pinch points in a journey that would stop somebody being able to make a combo travel journey, because of, very good reasons to do with safety, very good reasons to do with, whatever has led to that policy being put in place, but actually it's preventing alternatives to the car being adopted by, in particular, women with children, for example.
Yep, if I can add something, I totally agree about, with Karla and Scott. I could add, let's say, a short bit of information related to, I think one of the most important motivation behind this research topic is because the barriers limiting the use of public transport for women is also an economical issue in terms of sustainability of the entire system. So the data I would like to see as open in the near future is the one, let's say, collected directly from transport operator. So during, for example, the Diamond project, we one of the partners of the consortium was Velib in the Paris region, is the operator of the bike sharing services in Paris. So let's say they do collect data. Some of them are proprietary, some other open, but I would see very well the public authority which give us access to the city to a new operator, to ask them to collect more deep information, let's say, related to the perceived level of accessibility, for example, of the service. And then the public authority to make this data available for everyone. So to don't reinvent in the wheel, country by country, but also to have access to different contexts in the transport system in the region, and also to don't start, let's say, every time collecting new data, but also to, let's say, to start from some results.
Sharon, can I add a bit more?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. So I completely agree with what Andrea and Scott both just said. And I think there is also a responsibility for the designers of vehicles. And we need more research in that particular area, more data. So, for example, as you said, Sharon, with the handlebar, the handles on the tubes, for example, I guess on buses, public transport. And we also had some interesting comments about how bikes, the seats on bikes are not ergonomically suitable for a lot of women. They get, and here's an expression I never thought I'd say on a live panel, but they get a lot of vulva area pain. And that's a physiological situation with a lot of women. They are made not for that gender, so they're uncomfortable. If they're in pain, they're not likely to use bikes again. So, and handlebars, the grips might be for main for men, the height on micromobility scooters, that kind of thing. So all of those things, there needs to be a lot more deeper research into some of those aspects, I think.
And I think coming back on that one, anyone who's ever seen me go to a meeting knows I always show up in trainers and then put my posh shoes on when I get there. But for exactly the same reason, because I've got a skirt or a dress on, I can't cycle anywhere. I have to walk. So what I'd really love to see is just venues and offices and even shops, assuming you're going to show up in outdoor clothes and having some sort of facility where you can change out. And I know Jenny Martin's on this one. I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but in Austria, you quite often have lockers. So you can take your outdoor clothes and put them somewhere safe when you go to a museum or to a gallery. And I saw that Jenny Millard's talking about making active and public travel fit for purpose. And it really is this. How do we build it into our everyday life so it's not an inconvenience? You know, the number of times I have changed my shoes sort of propped up against a lamppost. Excuse me. But did anybody have any thoughts about how we can make it so that active and public transport seamlessly integrate, so we can keep swapping from these modes, but still look, you know, as fashionable as we'd like to and as comfortable as we like to? Scott.
Well, I was going to say, I think I'd like to echo, along with, I'm sure, everyone else who's participating today, the fundamental point, which is how do we begin to do something meaningful about the the behavior of men in society. So this, as Paul Green's pointed out, the kind of Scottish campaign about don't be that guy, what are the equivalents of that, and how can we use how can transport operators be a channel by which we then begin to then communicate and engage around the kind of behaviors that we do want to see, and discouraging the kind of, the behaviors that we really don't want to see. So having said it, it's therefore, how do we do that in such a way that it kind of it has an impact, and it's and the kind of the reach and the message and everything else is is effective. To the point about active travel, I think I think it's really important that we want active travel to be as accessible to as many people as possible, as often as possible. So in that sense, we probably want people to be able to dress for their destination, not for their journey, in the majority of instances. So that said, I believe there are opportunities to provide better interchange, to move between modes, and indeed recognize what some of the very practical barriers are. And Karla on a previous call has talked about sort of helmet head, for example. If you're thinking about cycling some distance, and you may be a little bit more like a sport cyclist, you might be traveling a number of miles, but I think it's also about, as you say, are there the ability to be able to put your things in, for example, a basket or on the back of a bike? What kind of capacity can you keep that stuff safe and protected, from the rain and the weather and the kind of conditions that we live in the UK? But also, how can we better enable people to be able to either take their bike or whatever it may be, and thinking about intersectionality. What about people with Isabel from Wheels for Wellbeing talks extensively about many of the people that are riding bikes within her community. They ride regular bikes, but they're not permitted, for example, to be able to ride their bikes in certain areas. And so security guards and others will come up to them and say, you're not allowed to ride your bike here. And actually, it's the easiest way for them to do that part of their journey, and they're made to feel like they're doing something which is not consistent with that place, and they're made, they're treated in a way that they don't feel comfortable. So I think it's kind of almost thinking through what is the right level of support to allow for the interchange to take place as effectively as possible between, for example, riding a bike or a shared bike or a cargo bike or whatever it may be, and then moving to the next stage of the journey in a well lit, open, well-used spaces, that make it feel like they're inviting for everybody.
I think that's a good point. I know I think it's the British Parking Association is certainly doing a project. I think it's called Park Active or Active Park or something. If there's anyone on BPA online, please do put it in the chat what the actual project is. Forgive me, Julian. But they're doing a good project on some of those interchanges, with regards to having showers in car parks and that kind of thing, so that you can park your bike there, have a shower, and then go into your office or whatever. But just I was in LA last week for the ITS World Congress, and LA everywhere, all bikes or all buses have a bike rack on the front. Just folds down, you stick your bike on, and off you go. And Scott, yes, I did get photographs for you. But it was so convenient, and it's one of the questions in here is about what surprised us. But the interchanges between transport modes, I found that quite surprising, actually, how complex that can be for a lot of people and how off-putting that can be. So if we can make that as easy as possible for everybody traveling, not just women and girls, then I think that will go a long way to encouraging more people to travel actively.
We had a range of suggestions that were very simple, really, which is, for example, the ability to be able to take a bike into and through certain areas, which is actually currently very difficult. For example, at train stations, it can be very difficult. But also the sense that you're being invited to do so, rather than you feel like you're doing so against the wishes of the people. So just having things like, the train operator staff wearing things like "I cycled here" as a badge. I mean, these were sort of the suggestions that came through from some of the study participants, which is almost, we shouldn't be needing to give people permission to do this kind of stuff. But actually, if it helps and it kind of makes it, people think, okay, well, actually, I feel better able to do so, then the more people are doing so, the more that becomes, and the more you see, people who look like you and you identify with, the more that you then feel that's something that you might do yourself. So there's a range of kind of quite rich insights like that I think are really important, that kind of bubbled out and may prompt, say, a particular transport operator to think, okay, well, yeah, I'll give that a go.
Andre, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I may say, totally agree about the need to provide, let's say, the infrastructure itself, for example, for bike sharing should be designed to be, let's say, more friendly. So also to accommodate, let's say, weather-friendly infrastructure, let's say, so sheltered docking station, but also, for example, child seats for the bikes. But I see also, it's true that if you look at the data regarding the trip of different transport mode chain, on a daily routine is very complex. And from what I see in Paris, there is also the need for a cultural change in the use, for example, of public transport and sharing bikes. So somehow, the research, the results from the research are somehow already there. And now we need some policy to encourage the cultural change.
Thanks. And I really like the comment that was on in the comment, lovely, about the difficulty of taking bikes on trains and what Scott mentioned. And it doesn't seem as common now, but I do remember when King's Cross used to have bikes changed pretty much everywhere. And I got the distinct impression that people had one bike for cycling to the station, got on the train, got off at the other end, got onto another bike and cycled to work. And it just seems mad that people are having to buy two bikes rather than just take their normal bike through the system. So I was going to move away from cities for a little while. I live relatively rurally. If I want to get to the station, it's a 25-minute walk or a bike ride. But how can we make people in rural areas feel safer? We've talked a lot about cities, about lighting, about data gathering, but do any of you have seen any good ideas of how to make rural areas more safe, which by their nature quite often do have lots of dark corners? Who'd like to start? Karla?
I don't have good ideas as such, but I can tell you that this is something that we are working on in another project with Innovate UK at the moment, with 42, the organisation 42 in various different rural areas. We've worked also with DFT and their rural strategies. It comes out, just not working on the strategy, but helping feed into it. And we are having a rural symposium, hopefully in November, I think the date is. And that symposium will really try and encourage some of the answers to those questions. So we already know what a lot of the challenges are, not all of them, but we know what a lot of the challenges are when it comes to rural travel and rural transport. So we want this symposium to really start bringing about some of the solutions. How can we bring innovation to find solutions to some of these challenges? Because they are very, very different when it comes to rural areas. And then you've got peri-urban as well in between, and then it goes to those connections between getting from a rural area into the city. And again, how can we use active travel in those particular scenarios? So how can we get some solutions for that? So it's certainly something that we are aware of and doing more work on in the next few months.
Either of the other two, you other two got any thoughts on this?
It's somebody who works in active travel as I do. The reality that cars will maintain a very real role because of their practicality, particularly in rural areas, it can be quite a divisive topic to look at. But I think as so much, particularly UK government effort and indeed innovation funding is thinking about the opportunity of EVs, I think there is an opportunity to then think about EVs in combination with active travel. So, if talking, Karla has been mentioned a couple of times in terms of the, considerations around parking, for example. So, can there be locales which are, where the park and ride, for example, is not necessarily jumping on a bus, but actually the second part of that, you might take your EV or whatever car it may be, but in particular your EV to somewhere that's out of town, and can you then park it? Can it then be charged? And can you then be essentially equipped to be able to make a seamless journey from there in a safe and protected cycle infrastructure to wherever your destination may be in what is likely to be a more, the more urban area, perhaps. So I think things like that, when we're thinking about where considerable innovation effort is going, is to then think about, well, how can we think about the kind of needs and lived experiences that came through this kind of research? How can those be met in those locations, rather than just think about what is the best way to put in EV charging infrastructure in an entirely kind of male and technologically led way?
Andre, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think for example, when we were working for Diamond to let's say, the infrastructure of the service, the railway service in the peripheral or rural area in the city of Barcelona, the most important factor for the people participating in the sample was the reliability of the service, which means to have, let's say, a sufficient level of security perceived by women, for example, in the infrastructure at nighttime. Also, let's say, the timing of the service to be reliable, and also the pricing option, because sometimes, very often the price of the ticket is much higher if the distance is bigger, let's say. Instead, the policy should be look at some new way for the pricing option to incentivize the use of public transport if you live outside the city. So I think the reliability of the service to incentivize the use of public transport in this area could be one of the best targets.
And that's interesting, because obviously rural bus services are suffering quite like a lot of public transport at the moment. On-demand transport's always been held up as a bit of the holy grail of making sure rural areas are supplied with transport, but women and younger girls and ladies may not want to be in an on-demand transport if there's only one other passenger in there. And I think particularly these ride-hailing services may ignore some of those issues. So I don't know if there's an option for you can press whether or not you're happy to go in a mixed mode of transport, or you want to go in gender specific, or are we actually then just going into the really expensive element of it just being a taxi ride? So if we're going to go into sort of shared services like this, how do we make sure they're safe? And what provisions do we have to put in place if you get into a vehicle and you do start feeling uncomfortable? I mean, I know it's a sort of doom scenario, but how do we make those provisions feel safe? And let alone when we get to autonomous vehicles and they may not even be a driver to help you. I don't know the answer to this one. Any suggestions, panel?
I don't know the answer to it, but I think I do think it's a really good question. I mean, I've mentioned this on panels before. We're very happy sitting on a tube thigh to thigh with some complete random stranger with their armpit in your face if you stood up. Yet getting into a smaller vehicle thigh to thigh with some random stranger, you feel very differently and uncomfortable. And I think there will have to be allowances for it. But I really hope that doesn't mean that they will be more expensive if you want to travel in a female only or a male only or whatever vehicle. I hope that doesn't impact prices, but obviously in some of the modern vehicles we've got cameras and things like that, so there will be those precautions, if you like, which I hope will alleviate some of those concerns.
Scott, do you want to add anything?
Not to that particular question. That was a particularly knotty question that you posed, which is a very good one.
Sorry. Andre, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's truly interesting to look at some near future transport mode, transport system. And during Diamond, one of the use cases was about the design of more inclusive interfaces for autonomous vehicle, looking at for example, small shuttle buses in urban areas. So could be, let's say, buses accommodating, let's say, 5 to 6 seats. So it's not properly a car, but also the way to design more accessible, more inclusive interfaces, also to incentivize the use of this new and more sustainable modes in the near future is not easy. But again, there are some, let's say, biased information regarding the potentials of this market in the EU region. So the women, again, seems to be neglected from the market, considering the research behind automotive market for the development of autonomous vehicle. So there is some barriers also in this scenario.
I mean, picking up the topic of CAV, I suppose. I mean, from a perspective of how do we get more and different people to more easily and more often move around by alternatives to the car. If we start off with that's what we want to optimize for, if that's a sort of preferred future, if you will, particularly in urban areas, then I think clearly there's the vital infrastructure investment that Active Travel England and will hopefully be supported by current government to both fulfill its current mandate, but also as we move into future parliaments, we'll be given ever more a larger piece of the pie of overall transport investment. I think that's kind of a fundamental preferred future as far as I'm concerned. I think then if we're thinking about connected autonomous vehicles, I think it's then also there won't in our considering how long it's taken the Netherlands to get to be as the Netherlands is, within my lifetime it's probably not going to be a reality that we have safe and protected end-to-end journeys throughout the UK. So therefore I think it's really important for the likes of the EV and the connected autonomous vehicle kind of innovators and lobby, for them to be thinking about how do those innovations interact with vulnerable road users. So bikes, e-bikes, cargo bikes, pedestrians and so forth. And I don't, in my work with the Bicycle Association on smart and connected cycling, for example, it's not something that I believe, that is, top of mind in many of the innovation programs that are currently being funded. And so I'd love to see more between the modes, between CAV and between active travel, in terms of thinking about, well, if there is going to be these two things are going to coexist, how can the two things be designed optimally to support more active travel? Because as we know, in taking the gendered view of that, the provision of safe and protected infrastructure is the key thing that will help more women and girls choose to actively travel. In addition to that, what are the other things that can be done to make all vulnerable road users feel and indeed be safer, compared in relation to EVs and CAV?
We've not got long left, but there was a really interesting comment I quite liked in the Q&A, and I'll read it. So putting it bluntly, how do we go from nice to have to must have in terms of gender-friendly design and planning? And particularly, how do we keep the funding away from poor schemes? So we've got I make it 7 minutes to solve it, but if we were trying to, yeah, exactly. If we were talking to our new transport minister, what would we be saying to her? How does she make sure that schemes are actually gender inclusive? And what tools does she have in her armory to make sure that schemes think about this, and ones that sort of don't cause bigger problems aren't funded? I don't know who'd like to go first on that one.
I think we've just got to be a bit more aware, haven't we? And certainly, I don't know about a new transport minister, but I know, for example, our relatively new chief scientific advisor at DFT, Sarah Sharples, is very aware of this, as is deputy chief scientific advisor Siobhan Campbell, who is often on her bike and turns up to meetings with her cycling gear. So I think we've just got to be a lot more aware. And I know that sounds like it's a bit passive, really, but it's not. We've got to sort of a bit like we're doing with when we get applications or things like that, we want to make sure that there's a gender balance or things like that, not just a gender balance, but all protected characteristics are covered. I think we've just got to add this to one of those I don't want to say tick boxes because that negates it as well, but to make sure that it's something that we are always thinking about, be more aware of. And all of us in these positions where we're able to ask those questions, say, but what about? And have you considered? And we need to be going back and asking those questions when it comes to applications for projects or general papers and things like that. We can challenge them, and we should be challenging them to make sure everyone considers it. I think that would definitely help. I've not solved it though, sorry.
I'd love to see a sort of Mariano Mazzucato style mission in which it's not a nice to do, but actually it's a, you know, it's something that is being elevated as being of critical importance across government departments, across the growth agenda. So, you know, if we need to frame it for this particular government in terms of what's the growth potential of it, well, let's evidence how by releasing the economic potential, I'm using a phrase that I think, you know, might work with this particular government, but, you know, of women and girls, by enabling to make more journeys more easily, more often, then that will release, you know, X in terms of value to the UK economy. But I suppose what I mean is, if we can frame this as being something that really matters, and it really matters to those that are most able to both fund and set policy and set regulation, then we may begin to see the kind of inroads that we want to see. And I think until then, it'll remain in the nice to do pile. So it has to be owned at a ministerial level. I think it has to be seen as a cross-government priority, and it has to be one of the things that we judge the success of transport operators, you know, in whatever section of the mobility mix they work in.
And I'll come last to you, Andre, because I think we're about to get kicked off the channel by the look of things. Any closing thoughts for you? How do we make sure that you only get money if your scheme is good?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but I mean, I would suggest let's say the transport department, local or national level, to avoid, let's say, using the flat universal design approach, let's say, which is very much focused on the ergonomics of the service or the infrastructure in terms of design, and to look more at the needs of specific target users, which is for sure more costly. Regarding data, for example, also if you think about the design of infrastructure for everyone, but looking at specific elements, which is tailored for everyone. And also I would suggest to raise the awareness about the problem. So also if you think about the solution that some countries abroad, South America, but or other regions, found to solve the problem was to segregate passenger by gender. For example, if you think railway infrastructure, so to avoid any solution which is useful just for the very near future. So to look at like a more far, let's say, horizon in terms of, let's say, 2050 or even longer, I mean, even bigger. So to raise awareness, to have dedicated infrastructure also and services to make everyone more and the problem more visible, let's say.
Thank you. Well, we've run out of time. I think we could probably talk for another couple of hours. Really appreciate you joining us today. Really appreciate all my panelists. As you can see, the recording of this session is going to be put up and there's the YouTube link there. Previous sessions are also available. We're always keen to have new ideas for discussions. So please get in touch with Juliana or Daniel if you'd like to get involved in future. And all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for attending. Travel safely. And yeah, hopefully we don't ever have to have, oh, I'd like to say we don't have to have this conversation again, but hopefully in 10 years' time, our successes in the transport industry won't be talking about this. Thank you very much. Bye.